Hello and welcome to Off the Cuff OTC, our new monthly show, which involves a conversation with a very interesting guest and even more importantly, a very powerful audience. Our guest this month is Mr. Arun Jaitley. If I try to describe all his portfolios, it will take a couple more minutes. So let's get down to talking right away. 7.5% growth, a little bit more now projected. If I ask for a show of hands and I ask you to close your eyes, because everybody in Bombay is scared of politicians, so they will not speak the truth if your eyes are open. But if you were not looking and I said, how many think does it feel like 7.5% growth? I think 90% would say at least.
And there's a good reason for it.
That it doesn't feel like 7.5%.
I'll tell you there's a good reason for it. Because this 7.5% growth rate, what is it being sustained on? It's being sustained predominantly on three factors. It's being sustained on much higher public spendings, much higher foreign direct investment, and a significant amount of improvement in urban demand. If we've had good rural monsoons, rural demand would have also picked up. That's impact on industrial balance sheets, etc. would have picked up. You see, what has happened is that your sample audience here is the private sector. Now, India's private sector had overstretched itself. It's built surplus capacities, it's taken huge amounts of money from financial institutions and banks. It's now busy servicing. Many of them are unable to service those amounts, and therefore their contribution in this is not what it really should have been. The private sector has actually normally leads the government, but in more challenging times the public investment has to come up in front and lead the entire process. And therefore, since everybody has his own issues in their sectors, etc., some of which we are now trying to address. And I don't necessarily take an adversarial position with the private sector because I quite understand the cycles which they are going through. They may not have the same feel.
But you also have this panoply of horrible three-letter words: CAG, CBI, CVC, etc., etc., etc.
You see,
I'm not counting RBI. This city is ruled by RBI. This district is ruled by RBI, BKC. But are we going to see a large-scale criminalization of bad debt?
You see, the bad debt or the NPAs that you speak about, I analyze it and divide it broadly in two categories. The first category are those which are essentially on account of the business cycles. And therefore, there is no element of, let's say, any kind of misdemeanor or dishonesty involved. There are some industries which have done badly.
So will you name some?
Okay, I'll explain. I'll just take about 2 minutes and explain this whole issue. The steel sector has the largest number. They are stressed because you had Chinese sending steel to all over the world, including India, at much below the cost price. So our companies were not being able to sell. Now, regrettably, when this was happening, the governments were not addressing this problem. Last 6 to 8 months, we've addressed it in a big way. We've imposed various kinds of, slightly increased the customs duty, also imposed other duties, etc. They rode the prices further, and now we've put a minimum import price. Today, I think we have broadly come to a position that there is a level playing field with the kind of three measures which we have taken between the Chinese steel and the Indian steel.
In the process, you made industry that uses steel uncompetitive.
No, it's not become
automobiles, for example.
There is a slight transfer of burden. There is a slight but don't forget, the European Union is planning to do the same. The Americans have imposed an exorbitant duty on the Chinese steel, several times more than what we've done. So the entire world is doing that. And if you had not done anything, then you would probably have this NPAs, a very large core industry in India closing down, and being unable to service. You had companies like Tata Steel running into problem. You had the Steel Authority running into problem. Forget the newer players who've entered. Now, if these companies run into difficulty, the government can't sit helplessly. You've then had, let's say, a major sector, the highways, which was at one stage a booming sector. And I regret to say the UPA left behind a completely paralyzed sector. Now, 2 continuous years of putting in a lot of public money, I think the sector has revived. And therefore, what the chief economic advisor in the economic survey called the twin balance sheet problem. So slowly the impact of the highway is developing. The third area which is very serious was power. The problem of power which has been left unaddressed. And that's a problem really not attributable so much to the private sector, but to the state governments. You are producing more power, you have a grid which distributes more power, but some state governments decided not to charge for that power or charge inadequately for that power. And who will fund it? Not the state budget, but just keep indiscriminately taking loans from public sector banks. And therefore you have 70,000 crores owed by Rajasthan's, huge amount by UP, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, and almost 15 state electricity boards are owing the money. And so we came out with this whole Uday scheme, in which the state governments have been told to take over the bank debt, or 3/4 of it. They've been told to issue bonds to the banks. And I think that problem now...
But Arun, there also, these were 12% loans, which are now being restructured with 8.5% bonds. So basically, we are still borrowing from our children.
No, you are absolutely right, because the situation had become almost irremediable. But in the process, the banks were going put, because the banks, somebody had to pay the banks. And therefore, you've now started addressing these problems. Now, there are textile, for instance, has a fair amount of NPAs. Infrastructure projects, because many of them are locked up in various disputes. So that's another issue which we've been addressing. Now, sectors which are doing badly, and therefore NPAs increased because of that business economic cycle, I think is more attributable to the economy. There is a second category of cases, and that second category of cases is loans given, inadequate securities taken, the businesses, I don't know whether people initially intended to repay them back or not repay them back, and suddenly there is very little chance of their recovery. Now, I think it is these categories of cases which from an ethical point of view presents a serious challenge.
Let's speak the M word then, Mr. Malia.
All I can tell you is, he's not only brought himself a bad name, he's brought a terrible name to India's private sector. He's given them a bad name, and the faster he settles, the better it is for him and for India's private sector. Otherwise, for people to start, banks and others to start trusting leaders of industry and well-known leaders, names in the industry itself will become difficult.
Public opinion right now is in a very abrasive stage. People want somebody punished. And there are dangers in criminalizing many of these things, because it might lead to a situation of na khuda hi mila na visale sanam. You may lose the money and you may not get the man back.
You see, every NPA, as I said, is not necessarily a criminal law violation. Where you had no intention of paying it in the first instance, where you fabricated documents, or where you've diverted money, I think some criminal law can come in. But every NPA per se may not have that same problem. But the whole objective is that there has to be an honest intent that this is public money which has to be paid back. You can't have a situation where 20 people are holding up so much money belonging to the banking system that they are preventing the banks from lending to 20,000 others. And that's the position at which we stand today. And therefore, these 20 people who are holding on to this money have to take bona fide and honest steps in order to see that an exit takes place. And frankly, let me tell you, Shekhar, and here I make a political point. You are a student of this subject. When steel, infrastructure, highways, sugar, textile, state discoms, when all these for the last few years were going into the red, the policy paralysis was such that can you, and it's your job to ask question, but here I'm asking you, do you remember a single step that the UPA government took in relation to any of these sectors?
No, most certainly not. In fact,
You see, if you can't recollect, therefore those sectoral problems have to be rectified. Now, additionally, even in your infrastructure setup, you need a dispute resolution mechanism where, you see, as you mentioned CAG and CBI, where without fear of CAG and CBI, you can quickly negotiate. I have in this budget announced that resolution of disputes relating to public contracts, I'll now have a legislative banking. We didn't have a bankruptcy law. Now, I've for the first time been working on it, and now I introduced it in December in Parliament. We are now in March, and the committee is doing its final reading. In the next few days, I'm expecting the report of the committee. In the second part of the budget session, I'll probably take that law up for consideration. And you seriously need an early exit law. Anybody in that position has to really seriously negotiate with the banks and come to a solution.
That's what the chairperson of State Bank said, that come back, state your assets under oath, and settle with us.
Obviously, that's any honorable man would do.
Sanjay Nair.
Sir, I just want to ask you, how comfortable do you feel in a very broad level with your budget maths? Because one of the important things is if inflation remains low and if your stimulus that you're putting in through the public spending takes a bit of time to come to fruition, it's not going to happen overnight. You know, what's going to happen? If you miss the growth target at a very nominal level, which is the problem nowadays, then you're going to miss or have pressure on the fisc, and then if you get contractionary again, I mean, I think there's a fear that if your budget maths don't work, what happens?
I don't, you see, if the, let's say if some unusual situation takes place which is unpredictable, the oil prices go through the roof and so on, these kind of probabilities you don't factor in, you factor in reasonable circumstances. While we've done the maths this year, we have not taken into account a significant amount of resource from taxes that we are likely to get. Now, in the budget, if you've closely watched, and this is a response to Shekhar's earlier question that what does secrecy do? For instance, one of the proposals, nobody anticipated that I was going to come out with this, that income which has escaped assessment till today, I give you an opportunity to declare that income within a particular window and pay 30 plus 15, 45% tax. At the first appeal stage in all the four, that's income tax, service tax, customs duty, excise, if your first appeals are pending, you pay the principal and interest till the date of assessment and you settle your appeal. On retrospective tax, you pay the principal if anybody wants to come and pay. Now, all these are likely to yield a significant amount of tax. Since it is unknown how much they would yield, we haven't factored it in. And therefore, if there is a slight deviation towards additional expenditure because any of the facts that you anticipate, I think there is some element of cushion that we have.
There's one little fact before we go to Ajit. Since we are the banking district, I repeat that, the combined market cap of all public sector banks is today lower or maybe marginally higher after fall in bond yields than HDFC Bank, which is not the biggest private bank, but second biggest. Now, isn't that a loss to the exchequer?
You see,
you didn't sell MTNL when it was 18,000 crores. Today, nobody will give you 1,000 crores for it. You are losing money for the taxpayer.
You see, the argument that you raise, in fact, I remember in this very city, about 16 years ago, when I had the responsibility as the first minister of the Department of Disinvestment, I had strongly argued for privatizing the public sector airlines. And I remember having said that if you don't do it now, there'll be nothing left to really privatize at the end of the day. But I think the example of public sector banks at the moment, it's not the appropriate time. there is some element of pressure on them, because these are banks which are not really choosing their customers. You see, they played a leading role in financing industry. They played a leading role in financing farmers. They play a leading role in
Financing the government.
or your small schemes like these microfinance schemes like Mudra, etc. So really they have a much bigger social purpose. So if they were only into housing loans or automobile loans or small customers, and these are very safe bets, probably their NPAs would have been far less, but so would have been India's GDP. So let's not understate the important role which some of them have played, and therefore it's extremely important to strengthen these banks. And I have indicated a roadmap, and the roadmap has been we strengthen these banks, we put more capital, the RBI has liberalized certain capital norms, we are now looking at consolidating some of them, and therefore the idea is to maintain them and strengthen them.
We have Deepak Parekh sitting here. His bank can take a decision which, if it goes wrong, shareholders will ask questions, board will ask questions, RBI will ask questions, but CBI will not ask questions. And CBI will not come to the home of his manager who gave the loan 5 years after she retired. You put public sector banks at a great disadvantage.
No, I think I read in recently that the Supreme Court has now said that CBI has jurisdiction over his bank also.
I thought you will take CBI jurisdiction away from public sector banks.
There's a recent judgment last month, I'm told, where you see the jurisdiction of the Prevention of Corruption Act, and their managers have also been held to be, by a process of judicial construction, held to be public servants. So hopefully there is at least parity in the matter of CBI.
Parity on the bad side.
But then you see, private sector banks have another, you see there are several challenges in functioning that the public sector banks function. I'll tell you the first challenge. The public sector banks decided to go in for campus recruitment. The court stepped in and said private sector can do it. You must have a written exam, then you must have an interview.
So the best UPSC pattern.
So the best student material available in the campuses will now go to the private sector banks. The others will write the exam. Second, the boards of public sector banks, I must say, it had become almost a fashion with every government to pack the board with government nominees.
Can I add something? It's also become a fashion for every minister to appoint his personal CA to one of the bank boards.
You see, not only that on the boards, there have been complaints that all these gentlemen who were being appointed were also load pushers. It's an extreme statement I'm making, but it's probably true. And that is why the Bank Board Bureau we have now created with Mr. Vinod Rai as the chairperson. So all these board appointments that the governments make or I make has to go through that board now. And therefore, there's a significant change that we've done. The appointment of the chairpersons and the executives of these banks, if you recollect, I had I appointed a committee comprising of the RBI governor and 2 other senior secretaries of the government to go into 7 appointments which were on my table of bank chairpersons. And after I received the report, we had to cancel those appointments and not give them a job. And then start a whole process by which I don't know myself till the file comes to me as to who's being appointed the chairperson or the managing director of a bank. Now that appointment has been professionalized. But still there are many handicaps, as you say. If, for instance, in an NPA situation, a private sector bank, till this judgment of the Supreme Court came, went to a private sector bank and said, all right, I am willing to settle for principal. The private sector bank would say, all right, let me clean up my balance sheet, it's a fair proposal. The public sector banker is scared for all these consequences.
Because you know,
and that is why,
what we call as haircut ultimately becomes a mundan.
No. At that stage, therefore, you require a particular system by which you have some kinds of an ombudsman mechanism by which this settlement
Which is
can
what
come
you're
about.
doing now.
Which is something which is now in the pipeline.
In the pipeline. And
So that the public sector banks are also empowered to take banking decisions on commercial considerations.
as empowered as, say, the group that brought Satyam back from the dead.
Some arrangement of this kind. Some arrangement of this
There are
kind.
some members of that group, I think, sitting here. The deserving person has got there. Ajit.
Well,
Ajit knows both. Ajit has built infrastructure. Ajit has also faced the stress of borrowing for infrastructure.
You very, very clearly outlined one of the reasons for the stress of the infrastructure, but I think you omitted to mention that there are legitimate dues that several departments of government or undertakings do not pay on time to the infrastructure companies or even for that matter construction. And that has also been a substantial reason for not being able to repay the banks. And I think it's just something that I wanted to add. But in addition to that, the extraordinarily high interest burden that the Indian industry faces is equally responsible for those high debt figures that you see with the banks. And we do not understand, with the inflation so low, why this continues to be such a high interest rate. Particularly, we're not able to understand, neither have we been given a clean explanation as to why Tata Motors or JSW Steel should pay high interest rate to bring food inflation down, which is a thing that industry is unable to understand, but not able to talk too loudly. Good part of your NPAs, good part of your debt that is not being paid is this high interest rate, which is killing the industry and also making it difficult for an investment climate to come about, because the IRRs now required are more than 20%, which is very high risk, and therefore few takers, few investors to back it. This has to come down to 10 if investment climate is to pick up. So with this, industry today is under this burden. Is there a way that the government can do something about it, or given what Shekhar just said?
I think you made 2 points. I think the first point, I would add something to it. When I mentioned that the highway sector was paralyzed, the first 17 odd contracts which the highway authority took out after the change of government didn't get a single response. Almost nobody responded, because the whole institution of those contractors who used to build the highways was so blocked with the disputes with the pending payments and so on. Now the problem with those departments was that they were scared of settling more than unwilling to settle, because there was no legislative protection that they had. Now, 2 things which I have done and 2 more which are in the pipeline to resolve this. The first that I did was that I've amended the arbitration law, and in the new Arbitration Act, you won't have to spend years before an arbitrator and then before a court. We've put in a chapter for fast track arbitration where everything is over in a year's time. Second, we've now created, to deal with those matters in court, a commercial division in every high court of the country. Third, if you saw this year's budget proposals, there were 2 suggestions which I am going to implement in the course of the year. First is that price revision where escalations take place. Government departments who were scared now will be empowered to negotiate. So if the steel prices go up, if the cement prices go up, if the land is not available and the project cost goes up, obviously then you have to pay for it. You can't say, I'll still pay you as per the old system, and therefore drive the contractor completely out of business. So in the budget itself, I have announced this step. And the 4th step that I have announced is that there will be a mechanism for resolution of disputes outside court with regard to the public contracts. Now, with regard to all these 16 lakh crore worth of infrastructure projects which have been held up in this country, and a lot of people are unwilling to invest because of no framework being there, I think is an issue which we have addressed. Secondly, when you speak in terms of interest rates coming down, obviously they have to come down. Now, for almost 1.5 years, we have inflation well under control. 16 months in a row, the WPI is in the negative. 16 months in a row. The consumer price index almost hasn't gone up beyond 5.5%. It's been always below that. And therefore, one of the deterrents in banks transmitting the rates itself was the small savings rates, which were partly subsidized by us. And therefore, they are being now made more realistic. Hopefully, I think the next few weeks are worth watching.
You know, Arun, in all my life, I meet a lot of people like you. I've never seen a human being whose eyes light up hearing someone else's problems, as Deepak Parikh's do. Because he is always looking for someone else's problem to solve. So Deepak, if you had this situation today in the banking sector, and throw away your hat of HDFC, you are the dean of the financial core in India, how would you address it? And if you have a question for the minister.
No, I think the steps taken by the government, finance ministry on banking with the paper they came out a few months ago and the budget are all absolutely the right direction. And if we pursue these to the final end, I think we'll have a much finer, better, stronger financial system. And I agree with the finance minister, the problems faced by the public sector banks. I wanted to ask a question on the budget, since we're talking about the budget. Different chartered accountants are giving different views on the dividend tax. There are 2-3 views on the new dividend tax of 10%. If you read the bill, it very clearly says a company, dividend from a company. So is it 10 lakhs from one company or 10 lakhs from all companies put together?
Well,
and because it's a singular, it's a company. So if you get 10 lakhs, more than 10 lakhs dividend from one company, then you have to pay tax. You can get 1-2 lakhs.
Well, I'm glad you brought it out because my own impression has been a combined dividend income.
Combined.
That was my own impression. So I'll probably recheck the language itself.
And if it's not that, you will rectify it to me.
Normally when the finance bill is passed, by that time the documents have been in public domain, and I think this is a great system we have. For 1.5 months the finance bill and all the documents are in public domain. Even when you make the fine print, every time some lapses or errors could take place, and therefore it gives you a time to correct them.
So, Deepak, before you sit down as the dean of the banking core, what is it?
I have one more question. That the 10% tax is after 10 lakhs or including the 10 lakhs? Even that the chartered accountants are saying different things. You know? So even that I think should be clarified when you pass the bill.
All right,
So,
I'll take the suggestion.
I said, since you are the dean of the banking core, what is your advice to the Malyas of this world? Not just Mr. Malia, but there are many Malyas.
You see, some of the medias have been, some of the TV channels are chasing me to do a program on what is the difference between a business failure and a fraud. There's a thin line between that, or there is a distinction between a business failure and a fraud. And when business failure happens, and the example is given of the airline industry, with high ATF prices and fuel prices, no airline could survive. I think the government over the last 5 years would have given about 30,000 crores to Air India. Now, Air India does not pay for ATF. Air India does not pay Airport Authority. Air India does not pay the caterers. Now, some of these companies are listed companies. Like if you are a shareholder of BPCL, they've got a massive payment to be received from Air India. And government, it's a business failure. It is nothing to do. You need airlines, you need transportation. Fuel prices are a weakness.
So what will you tell Mr. Malia?
So I will tell him he must come back and settle, and he has enough resources. May not be able to pay the full amount, but at least try and pay whatever best he can.
I think, Deepak, I may just make a point, which is probably a contrarian point of view to that. In a business failure, circumstances beyond your control or the business cycle, the costs involved, the whole sector does badly. Now, in the same sector, people who are working in competition with you
Have made money.
have survived, and some of them have survived well. That means there was also something wrong with the model that you developed.
So, you know this 9,000 crores which you people talk about, I think it is made up of...
Not we people.
The press talks about, is interest on interest, penalty. So if you remove some of that and it comes to a reasonable number, I'm sure he'll come back and settle.
Barka?
On Vijay Mallya, he's triggered a Raghuram Rajan first started in an interview to Shekhar. And that was this entire idea that if you're a defaulter, you do have to be a little sensitive of about how you spend. And Indians don't actually respond very well to ostentatious spending. Where do you weigh in on this debate? Because, you know, we've moved well beyond a socialist culture. I think we're sitting in a room where that is pretty much evident. There are people like your Chief Economic Advisor, Arvind Subramaniam, who believes how corporates spend their money is irrelevant to this debate. There's the RBI governor who says it's offensive actually to common sensibilities.
Well,
So
I think
your thoughts on that?
I think there are sensitivities involved. You can't now segregate your personal wealth completely away from your business and then say, well, I'll lead a very lavish lifestyle, but as far as the public banking system is concerned, I'm unable to settle. Now, without going into the facts of this case, I have no doubt in my mind that I'd probably be more inclined with what the RBI governor has said.
Uday Shankar, when everybody goes insolvent in this country, he will be rich. Because people will get depressed and go home and watch his channels, Star.
I hope so, Shekhar. But Mr. Jaitley, just to take you back to politics for a minute. You know, from a distance when we see this, one of the most disturbing things to have emerged over the last several years is complete collapse of consensus around any issue in Indian politics, whether we see it in parliament or whether we see it outside parliament. While multi-party democracies do very well with some kind of disagreement, and often the debate is very intense and sometimes shrill, there is always some issue that we expect which are above what we call above party politics. And increasingly we are seeing this complete collapse, and this is unfortunately not something that's limited to just one party. The contagion has spread almost everywhere. Does it sound really, really alarming? Because from a distance when we see this, one of the most bleak scenarios for India seems to be coming out of this collapse of consensus.
Well, I thought you had stood up to make a confession, but since he hasn't made a confession, I'll make a disclosure. Uday Shankar is a graduate of JNU. So plead very guilty.
You see, I'll tell you, I've been analyzing this myself. It's true that where you stand on various issues now depends on where you sit in parliament. For instance, I least expected that the opposition to the GST will come from the Congress. I least expected that the opposition to Aadhaar will come from the Congress. They may probably have the same argument against some of my friends when we were in opposition. Fair enough, that only substantiates the point you're making. I think there is one more phenomena, and this is, I am addressing Shekhar and his entire team here. You see, there are a large number of issues, some social, predominantly developmental, economic, etc., in which India needs a consensus. Now, unfortunately, what is happening is that barring on these issues, which are more economic and so on, the political media in India has less interest in these issues. And therefore, if you saw how the intricacies, for instance, I've struggled in the last 5 days, and I want to use this as an opportunity to, one of the issues in the Aadhaar bill was, to what extent can privacy be encroached upon? So I argued in Parliament that I am one of those, notwithstanding the legal debate, who believes that privacy is a part of fundamental rights, a part of your liberty. One newspaper headlined, "Privacy not a fundamental right," argues Jaitley. Exactly the opposite. Therefore, the level of reportage has come down. The second point, the only exception to the breach of privacy could be national security. That's the law you have in England, that's the law you have in the US. National security is the only exception. Now my friend from the Congress party got up and said, oh, this is too liberal. So national security should be replaced by public safety and public emergency. I said, but that's very broad. Why should you want to breach privacy for these reasons? And the whole debate was, in the name of privacy, they wanted to actually do something which would have done damage to the whole cause of privacy. I have not seen a single media report or even an editorial which went into the depth of this issue. I'm not making a complaint out of this. But if, let us say, there is a silly or a shrill, loud remark, an uncouth remark made by any member, you could probably have 2 hours of discussion in the evening television on this. I think now time has come, if you have to move in this direction, that if serious issues are to take center stage, consensus is possible, then there must also be an ability to ignore people on either side who want to make these kind of comments just to get themselves to be the focus of the debate in that evening. And I think India now needs a level of public discourse which is far more serious. And probably if we did that, public scrutiny would be higher and consensus could emerge.
Well, thank you very much, Arun, and thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. So thank you very much. We'll be back next month with another very interesting guest. Although I must say, it'll be a tough act to follow after Arun Jaitley. So thank you all, and thank you, Arun.